Hello, today we're here with Felice Belle, poet, and she's going to read and discuss her poem for Sign and Breath. Welcome, Felice.
Hi, Phil. Thanks for having me. It's awesome to be here. So, this poem is called The Following Does Not Depict Any Actual Person or Event. When the detectives come to question you, keep gardening, lifting boxes, cleaning the gills off the fish. New Yorkers can't stop moving. You need to pick up your kids. You wish you could be of more help, but you're late for the airport class. If there's cash on the body, it's not a robbery. Every suspect has means, motive, and opportunity. The evidence speaks. The president of the Abstinence Club could be the rapist. They recycle storylines. It's not the first time the killer is an adult pretending to be a high school student. Trust your gut. A patriot can be turned. We can't all be good. It's the third law of physics, equal and opposite. Can't have the high without the low. If it feels personal, you're too close to the case.
Wow. I can't stop myself from the at the end of that poem,
Awesome.
Felice.
Thank you.
What a beautiful, terrible, uh, awful poem. Terrible that it had to be written, I think,
Hmm.
but absolutely cathartic that it was. Tell us about the origin of this poem. Tell us about how this amazing construct occurred.
Sure. So I am a huge fan of Law and Order, the franchise in general, but specifically Special Victims Unit, SVU. Um, and I have watched so many episodes of Law and Order that I literally think of myself as a detective. Like, I think I can solve any case you put in front of me. What's funny is my best friend, in addition to being a writer herself, is also a licensed private investigator. And so she finds it offensive that I think I'm a detective, having watched Law and Order episodes. So we had this argument for years. And we had done a two-woman show a few years ago called Other Women. So this actually started out as a monologue where I was making my case for how much I knew about solving crimes, essentially. So a lot of these lines are actually taken from the plot points of Law and Order episodes and just in general, sort of what I've learned about detective work from crime procedurals. But I think what's interesting is when you string them all together, right, it becomes this whole other narrative of its own, which I appreciate about poetry in general, but this poem specifically.
Yes, and in fact, we share that same faux identity. My father was a detective
Oh,
in the
wow.
NYPD
That's
for
awesome.
years, so I go around thinking of myself as Detective Brady. Um, but in this poem, of course, not I mean such an interesting source, but of course, you bring so much more to it.
Mhm.
You bring not only a New York, but a whole dynamic, a whole system of uh, a perspective about law and order.
Mhm.
Tell us about how your poems speak to the social world that this poem lives in and speaks for.
I think when it comes to storytelling, specifically in America, culturally, how we tell stories, there's a good guy and a bad guy, right?
Mm,
There's very little nuance. And the fact is, we've all got the spectrum within us and make choices every day to like choose good over evil or whatever it is. And so I think there's something about this poem that is aiming to get at those nuances, right? This idea that the president of the Abstinence Club could be a rapist, right?
mhm.
It's like whoever this identity is I might present, there's many other identities that are not coming to the forefront, and how do those play in the world internally and externally, I think is something the poem is moving through. Same with a line like a patriot can be turned, right?
Mm.
the fact that you hold one belief system, right? I think I find myself challenged by the world constantly and reevaluating the things that I held as unassailable truths, right? And then what do I have to do when my belief system is destroyed by the world? Like, how do I create a new one out of that? Um, yeah.
Felice, I have not yet had the pleasure of hearing you read in person, but I have had the pleasure of listening to your wonderful recitations in TED Talk, which can be found on YouTube. And I'm looking forward to hearing you read at the Maslow Family Creative Writing residency this June at Wilkes University. And I have to ask because if having heard you read in a recorded session, I know that orality is very much a part of what you present. And I'm wondering how that plays into your composition. How does the oral recitation of your poems become an aspect of your composition?
Yeah, I think for me, there's never been a separation between the composed poem on the page and the orality of it. To me, those things are very much intertwined. My parents are from the Caribbean, Guyana, specifically in South America, and they to this day can still recite poems that they memorized in their youth, right? And so for me, that idea of the poem being alive when it's recited just is something that's in my DNA. So I definitely use um, the orality of the poem as an editing tool, right? So if I'm reading the poem to myself out loud, I can hear things that are not working, things that are not working within the meter, let's say, of the poem, whether or not it's got an actual form to it, but also just things that might ring false or untrue in terms of the concepts in the poem. And so I want there to be a musicality to it. I want there to feel like the poem has its own rhythm. I want there to be moments of slowing down and speeding up. And I think the orality can do that, but I also think the text can do that. And so those two things combined help me to create a mood and a music, right, to the poem itself.
You know, for me, Felice, this poem not only has that music, and it's interesting to talk about the thrum of meter beneath the line, but it also has a kind of complexity and cutting edge sense that that I wonder. It's interesting that you bring up the orality of your parents and the tradition from the Caribbean, but you also come from a tradition of science and engineering,
Mhm.
and you have that background, as so many great poets have had. W.C. Williams being a physician, John Logan being a biologist. So many poets bring that. Tell us how that background of yours, so much, so eclectic, and so out of the mainstream of the MFA type programs, how that uh, influences your sense of composition and your sense of tradition.
Hmm. Um, I love science as a field because it's all about discovery, right? Having an idea, thinking it's true, and then going through the process of whether or not it holds up in different circumstances over time. And so I think I used to be the type of writer who had to write things as is, right? And I think that might have been the science influence, right? Like if the bed was orange in real life, it's going to be orange in the poem because that is what was quote unquote true. Um, and I think what poetry has done is soften me a bit, so it's less about whatever the literal truth was and more about what the emotional truth is, right? And so, how do I get to the truest expression of the thing um, in a way that can veer wherever I want it to be without sticking to the color orange? Another thing I think about is one sort of overlap between the science and the poetry is this idea that, and I think I mentioned this in one of the poems in the book, that words have a place value, right? So if you're in the same way that numbers have place value, if I can construct this poem and put the words in the place that belongs to them, then the poem as a whole will have the greatest value. And so I think there is a sort of precision when it comes to the editing and revision process that is definitely informed by my science background.
As is really evidence here in the fact that the two single lines, one in this poem, the evidence speaks,
Mm.
and the other, trust your gut.
Mm.
You know, poised between those two sensibilities. And of course, the one stanza that has three lines is the third law of
Mm.
physics. So I guess that leads me to ask about just the way this poem and many of your poems in Viscera, which is, I'm delighted to say, is forthcoming from Etruscan, compose the page as a field.
Mm.
And you've talked a little bit about the use of orality. Maybe tell us a little bit about the use of typography in your
Mm.
poems.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in my early poetry instruction taught, I think this is true, that I was taught that the poem on the page is sort of your notation for the reader,
Mm.
right? So in an ideal world, anyone could pick up this poem and have the reading experience that I might deliver if I was reading it in front of the audience. And that's true to some extent and not true to another extent, because I'm sure I might put emphasis in places a reader might not. But definitely when it comes to the construction of the line, right? The amount of words, the breath, where the breaks are, those are very much conscious in a musical notation kind of way, like hold this for half a beat. This one's going to be a full whole note. That kind of thing I think is always at play when I think about the poem on the page.
Mm. You know, you've mentioned now the orality that you bring from your background and your parents, the TV show that you've enjoyed watching, and which has been one of the sources of this poem, and also the science background. Who are the poets that you hearken to that first brought you into this journey?
Hmm. I think two of my earliest influences were E. E. Cummings and Entezaki Shange. And I think it's because of both of them that all of my poems are written in lowercase for the most part.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
That was just sort of, that felt right to me. There's something about all the words or the letters being the same size that feels like this is how you do poetry. One of the things that I loved about E. E. Cummings was there was always a sense of playfulness or wit, at least in the few poems that I was exposed to at an early age. And I think Entezaki just opened up what poetry could be. My first piece that I was introduced to by her was For Colored Girls, which is a play
Mhm.
that she calls a choreo poem, which is a word that she invented. And so I just love that idea of, if the word doesn't exist for whatever it is you're doing, you can create it, right? If there's no genre to hold the leaps and risks you want to take, you can make your own, which is what she did. But also Entezaki, I love discovering other works of art and artists from work that I'm reading, right? And For Colored Girls as a piece is filled with so many references to musicians and historical events and figures. And so it became its own kind of map to discovering the work and the art of other people, which I love.
Well, you are making your own map, uh,
Oh,
Felice, based on all these other maps that you've integrated into your work. And we're so looking forward to your book coming out.
thank
And
you.
thank you for joining us,
My
Sign and Breath.
pleasure. Thank you for having me.